Hi everyone, welcome back to the ReVolting Podcast. I'm Una Brosnan.
I'm John MaCaskill. Hi.
Hi, John. We've got our cracker today. We've got our first guest, our first industry expert who's going to join us today on the podcast. And I suppose this is a reminder our listeners to cast their minds back to December, where we kicked off a two-part series around leapfrogging, and the first of that was very much orientated around Africa. So, John, you certainly went on the hunt on finding an industry expert, and I think you find an absolute cracker.
Really
introduce who we've got.
Yeah, really excited. We've got Dr Rebekah Shirley, who will introduce in a minute, and of course Rebekah will introduce herself much better than I will. But I love doing the research for that episode because it was not about offshore wind and floating wind, and I was uncovering totally new insights and surprising insights, and Rebekah was a name that I came across a number of times in the research of this in terms of papers and articles, and so you put the name aside, and then when we started talking about actually maybe digging into this further and doing some interviews, Rebekah was the first one that I wanted to reach out to, and absolutely delighted that we got a good response, really interested, and I'm really looking forward to this interview. So I don't know if we should maybe just
I think let's crack on.
Stuck into it.
Let's crack on and let's get into the detail with Rebekah.
Great stuff. So before we do that, everyone, before you sort of totally lose yourself in what will be a fantastic discussion, please can you press subscribe, like, comment. It really helps us build this community. It's a way that it allows us to reach more people. It shows a bit of support, and we really appreciate that. So, with that being said, let's get stuck into this interview. Thanks. Hi everyone, we're really excited to be joined by Dr Rebekah Shirley. Rebekah is the Deputy Director for Africa at the World Resources Institute, leading local teams to deliver sustainable solutions for people, nature and climate. Prior to joining the WRI, Rebekah was the Chief Research at Power for All, where she launched major research-based campaigns, including Powering Jobs, Utilities for the Future, demonstrating novel solutions for advanced energy access across the globe. Rebekah earned her PhD in Energy Resources as the Chancellor's Fellow in the University of California in Berkeley. Rebekah is a TED speaker and has received many Young Leader Awards for her work, scholarship and public speaking. Hailing from the Caribbean, Rebekah now lives in Nairobi, Kenya. So, delighted you could join us at the ReVolting Podcast. Rebekah, join Una and I and the audience. Now, before we dive into the fossil fuel ladders and grid economics that we're going to be sort of chewing over, could you please introduce yourself more fully to our audience, your work, your interests, but also what was it that first pulled you into the energy sector? What brought you in?
Well, hi, John and Una. It's such a pleasure to be here. I also am very excited about this podcast, the really fun topics we're going to be talking about today. As you said, my name is Rebekah Shirley. I'm the Deputy Director for Africa at the World Resources Institute, where every day I have the honor and privilege of supporting a team of almost 200 local researchers based on continent who are delivering data, analysis tools, relevant research that really supports local communities and public as well as private sector actors in designing solutions to some of the continent's most pressing problems, like the lack of energy access, while we try to center people, nature, and climate in those solutions. And as you said, I'm an energy systems modeler by background. Before coming to WRI, I spent, maybe 15 years, if not more, building integrated power systems models across Latin America and South Asia and Southeast Asia and the Caribbean, where I'm from, basically helping to stop large dams and coal power plants being built in favor of more sustainable energy solutions like small-scale solar, hydro, etc. So, it's a great question of how did I even land here in this space of work? And as you mentioned, I hail from the Caribbean, from Jamaica and from Trinidad. My father from Jamaica, mom from Trinidad, and grew up between the two. And growing up in the Caribbean, especially in that period of 2007, 2008, 2009, the financial crisis. I don't know how many of your listeners will remember those times, but we got to see a lot of what an overdependence on fossil fuel resources that are not your own can do. So in a country like Trinidad, which owns and has a very large reserve of hydrocarbon resources, that was actually a time of prosperity for the country, whereas the other half of my heart in Jamaica at that time was really suffering. We could see it affecting everything from social services to the cost of food, the cost of transport, ultimately lots of companies and businesses closing down, people losing jobs. And so I think for me, it was seeing that juxtaposition that got me very interested in energy security. I wasn't actually even coming at it from a climate angle. At first, I was really interested in sort of just securing the communities that I care about. And I say, we have so much solar and wind and wave power here. Why are we not using them? Let me try and understand what are sort of the fundamental issues to be solved for. So that's what got me into the space. And I had the opportunity to go study at Berkeley in California, UC Berkeley. It was a fantastic opportunity. And it was there being exposed to scenarios in India, in Malaysia, in Laos and Vietnam, and Panama and other countries across Latin America. I started to realize, gosh, these issues that I'm concerned about from a small island point of view are incredibly universal. We're all dealing with the same issues, and all trying to secure futures for people, for nature, and for climate. And so that sort of was my entry point into, I have skills that I could use to support communities and help communities, especially communities across the emerging markets world, to find solutions that are sustainable and that work for us. So that's what landed me in this more international space of energy transitions, and it's evolves and changes every couple of months. Is something new on the scene, so it's a really exciting space to be working in.
It's really exciting, and look, Una and I are really excited to be having this discussion and an interview with you. So we're going to delve straight in. This carried on from a December podcast where we looked at the fossil fuel ladder and how I just zeroed in one area, which was transportation. How there seems to be technology leaping. So I mean, the fossil fuel ladder, that concept says that fundamentally that as incomes rise, car ownership rises, petrol demand rises with it. Then some of the assumptions that I read is that then Africa and other developing parts of the world, according to many fossil fuel forecasters, is supposedly the last great growth market for the fuel used by combustion engines, for its, hence the extender of hydrocarbons in the road in the transportation demand slice. But when you actually look at mobility in African cities, that story potentially doesn't quite fit. So Rebekah, I mean, why are 2- and 3-wheelers and buses electrifying before private cars? And what does that tell us how mobility really works across African cities?
It's a great question, because I think the story of the e-mobility revolution and transition in Africa is almost kind of an underdog story, where you didn't expect it. And out of the blue, these countries are so much at the forefront of what's happening in a global transition, a global technology transition. So it's a really fascinating story, because you're right that African cities are some of the fastest motorizing cities in the world, because of that growth in economics, that sort of income growth. We're starting to see a lot more car ownership and transportation and mobility via motorized means on the continent, and that has a lot of implications for what type of vehicle stock is going to be adopted in the continent. And I'll come back to the sort of the internal combustion engine vehicle stock, but what has been, and the trends there, I think what has been more exciting and what's been more surprising to rest of world is that the EV market, even though still small in absolute terms, is seeing growth rates that are some of the fastest in the world, driven, as you said, largely by electric two-wheelers, like the bikes and three-wheelers, e-buses, etc. And we have countries like South Africa, Kenya, our neighbors Ethiopia, our neighbors in Rwanda, Tanzania, Ghana, Morocco. These are all sort of explosive markets right now for electric mobility, especially the two and the three-wheelers. In Kenya, where I live and work, just last year, the reports came out that 15% of all new motorcycles that were being sold across the country, not just in Nairobi, were electric. So that's just to give you a sort of a sense. And you're asking why? Like, why is this happening? And I think the trend in electrifying two and three-wheelers as well as buses before private vehicle stocks can be attributed to a number of factors that reflect the sort of the unique nature of mobility and why the story should never be a singular monolithic story. In Africa, for instance, cost effectiveness and affordability is king. And so two and three-wheelers are obviously much more affordable for the majority of a population compared to private cars. They basically provide a cheaper entry point into motorized mobility. Similarly for buses, we have a lot of para and informal transport systems that operate across African cities. So we have a lot of minibuses and SACCOs for buses, larger buses, etc., that basically make up a large proportion of how people who are getting around in motorized ways are doing so. And so these tend to be the lower cost ways of getting ourselves around the city, and we have large portions of the population that work in the informal economy and rely on these sort of paratransit and informal spaces, and they happen to also be the cheapest entry points, the least expensive entry points for electric alternatives. So the electric bikes and electric buses, those price points come in much lower than the comparative price point of an electric private vehicle globally, not just in Africa, of course.
Yeah.
So those are some of the... Sorry?
No, absolutely. I was going to say 15% penetration is so impressive. And I suppose, how does that impact on the grid? Can the grid, one of the common arguments here we have in Europe in particular, when you have that much penetration in the market, you go back to, can the grid take that? Or is it too weak? Or how are you dealing with it, I suppose, on the ground? Or how is the system dealing with that on the ground?
That's a great question too. Let me say one thing on policy as a driver, and then I'll answer that question, Una. But I think it's important to note that the EV transition is not just happening sort of organically in Africa. It's actually very policy push type of transition. And something I think doesn't get enough attention is the fact that our current mobility markets are really driven by the fact that we spend so much paying foreign-owned petroleum companies for the fuel that then comes into the country and gets and is in all of our gas stations. In Kenya, for instance, for every liter of petrol that's sold, the government is subsidizing 30 of those 40 shillings or 30 of those 40 cents, as it were. And so from a policy point of view, not just from an end user point of view, a shift to electric mobility, especially for countries that have a very high renewable energy potential, is sort of, it's clear and it's simple. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that there's a real policy push behind this. In countries like Ethiopia, the government has entirely banned internal combustion engines, like at all. In Kenya, we have a draft mobility policy for electric vehicles and so on. So there's quite a intentional push in this direction. Very progressive. Now, Una's asking a great question, right? Which is, that's all well and good, and the economic argument may make sense, but is this feasible, and are the grids strong enough, resilient enough? This is a very, very fair question. And given everything that is always said about renewable energy potential in Africa, we have to honestly acknowledge the many unique challenges that African cities face with regard to grid infrastructure, especially because African power systems are largely underdeveloped compared to their counterparts. And this is, of course, given the historical context in which power utilities and the foundational infrastructure emerged in the early 1900s. It was never really about access for local populations, right? It was aiding the extraction of primary commodities and convenience of a small elite. We all know that. And so what it means is that today, not only is there very limited generation on the continent, but even where there is generation capacity, estimates from the IEA and more say that at least 40% of that is unusable due to poorly maintained grids with high transmission and distribution losses. So it's a really important question that you've raised.
Yeah.
And I dug into this recently. I did a study with my colleagues at Amherst in Massachusetts, where we actually we looked at this exact thing and tried to think about the impact of electric vehicle fleet expansion on the grid in Nairobi as a pilot or as an example. And what we found is that the adoption of EVs across the public and paratransit space, as I was talking about, that sort of informal space, can actually improve grid conditions. This is because you tend to adopt larger load bases, right? There's more consumption happening during periods when the grid is otherwise at very low consumption capacity in the evenings, in the middle of the day, and so that can actually help. However, very widespread conversion of private vehicles, which is actually still the largest vehicle class in the city, if that happens, what we're going to see is an exacerbation of peak loads that can actually lead to the overloading of transformers and cause a lot more challenge in terms of equipment replacement and maintenance. So all of that technical jargon just to say that it really, really depends on how charging happens in a city. If we're doing coordinated charging, well, this can actually be a boon and a benefit. But if we're doing things uncoordinated, especially during peak hours, we can find ourselves in a lot of problems.
That's really interesting, because it's certainly a problem, and it's certainly a problem here in the UK. I know some of the transmission distribution bodies are certainly trying to grapple, and I suppose as part of the electricity pricing here in Europe, they're trying to get their heads around how they shape that policy. And actually looking to Africa is really, really interesting to see where you've grappled this well ahead of us. And I think, John, you had that stat on Ethiopia as well. I mean, how do you turn a country like that? It's so impressive to see that policy strength and really, really, really drilling into that. It's certainly, I think there's, and we'll talk about lessons learned maybe later, but it's certainly something we should sit up and listen to, particularly here in Europe, and take some learnings, because it is this grid discussion is in depth, and certainly we are struggling to grapple that concept of when everyone plugs in, or what happens. We're struggling with what happens when everyone turns on the kettle and watches Coronation Street, which is the latest series here. So it's difficult. But no, thank you for that. That's been really, really good insight. John, have you got some question maybe around, go back to our leapfrogging side, I think?
Yeah, so it's because obviously I got into this when I was researching the one for December, when I was digging into how OPEC Plus, i.e. how some of the big fossil fuel forecasts, what kind of concepts do they have, and that caused me to look at the ladder. And then what spoke my interest was this potential leapfrogging, this technology leapfrogging that seemed to sort of come up. So that was my original interest, was to sort of, are the oil demand models misreading some of this? So I'm not saying what the scale and the impact is to these forecasts, but are they potentially misreading Africa? I mean, if the real electrification story is fleets and buses and bikes, not private cars, does the last petrol growth market narrative that I do read when I read these, does it start to unravel that narrative, Rebekah?
I love that question. It's really good because you kind of almost have to break that question into two parts. Because when we talk about leapfrogging and the last frontier, and we hear that narrative of Africa as the last frontier oil market, we hear that narrative all the time. We have to break it into the demand side part of that equation and the supply side part of that equation. Supply side, let's unpack that a little bit later, because I think there is a lot to be said about discoveries now being made in frontier basins for hydrocarbons across the continent. But on the demand side, which is where the narrative I think is related to this EV conversation, is the question is, will economic development actually increase oil consumption on the continent to the extent that it becomes the next major center of oil demand? It's an unlikely, for me, it's unlikely that the continent will become a center of global oil demand. And as I said, we'll cover supply a little bit later. I say that because obviously vehicle ownership is rising, and it's the rate of motorization and the rate of EV fleet conversion within that stock of vehicles is very rapid. But when you look at the total numbers, the aggregate numbers, they're obviously still very low compared to the rest of the world. And so it's very unlikely to be a new frontier for oil demand. That said, I think we shouldn't assume that, well, especially because the numbers are low, it's going to be super easy for Africa to just, switch over into EVs and there's nothing left to be done here. We have to talk about the criticality of policy, as I mentioned, and the criticality of really integrated, sophisticated management of these grid and charging and road infrastructures. So the transition is happening. It's not organic. It's not going to be organic. And this is actually exciting because it means there's a lot of room to get involved and partner. It's not just the bike companies and the technologists that are part of this conversation. There's many elements of knowledge needed here: researchers, policymakers, and sister cities, utility planners, financiers. So just a plug for your audience that it's really important for us not to sort of lean into a false security of, sure, this transition is just going to happen on its own because all of the conditions are ripe. We really do have to work together if it's going to be realized at scale.
Yeah, absolutely. And the amount, I think it's unappreciated, the amount of policy work that goes in the background. But Kenya is way ahead of us here. It's so impressive to see that. We are, as I say, with the grid, we're grappling that still. I suppose looking at the fossil fuel ladder and moving a little bit across into kind of the clean cooking side, when we talk about the fossil fuel ladder, and the first rung is generally often biomass to gas to electricity. In parts of Africa, we're seeing that rung being skipped altogether, particularly when it comes to cooking. And I know that area is certainly a point of interest in some of your research. It'd be really good to hear where and what you're seeing in that fossil fuel leapfrogging.
Yeah, well, this is good because now we're swinging like to the complete other end of the spectrum of technological advancement. Short answer to your question, Una, is that biomass resources, meaning for the audience who may not be aware, like fuel woods, charcoal, etc., is still overwhelmingly the dominant cooking fuel in sub-Saharan Africa in 2026. And that ladder that we often talk about is biomass into gas into electricity. Yeah. That ladder is not happening. It's not being skipped at scale in Africa. And in fact, reliance on wood and charcoal resource is actually rising, not falling in the region. So it's a really fascinating juxtaposition to the EV story.
Yeah. And do you think that's cost related, or is it behavior orientated, or where do you think, why is it happening, I suppose, in that manner?
Yeah, well, today still about 60 to 80% of primary energy consumption across the continent is biomass-based consumption. Yeah. And we have to ask ourselves, if we were just saying that the continent is sort of in an economic upturn and there is development happening, there's economic growth happening, why is that the case?
Yeah.
And I think that we have to look at the fact that there are many factors that relate to the use of biomass, and it's groups like the Clean Cook Stoves Alliance that have to be given real commendation for hard work behind the scenes to bring this topic to a very high level in the political agenda. Effectively, we have to think about the number of different things that would have to fall into place for a shift from biomass-based cooking into gas and other types of technologies, and the multiple sort of systems that would need to align. Because as you've said, it's partly about energy supply and having, LPG, electricity available. It's partly about infrastructure and distribution systems. So, grid, like we were just talking about, but in the context of LPG, it's storage and transportation and the retail networks. It's partly about the reform of tariffs because fossil fuels like kerosene are very heavily subsidized. It's also about appliance affordability, who can afford these new types of stoves. And then, as you said, it's social norms, it's trust, it's behavior change, it's culture. So I think cooking is such an interesting case because it's not just a technology or finance challenge. It's really sort of everything about our humanity and our society comes together in this issue. And so many things have to we would have to get right for a real transition to happen from biomass.
So, I mean, it really does. Everything bears down. I mean, everything's down to behaviour, human behaviour, isn't it? But this seems to really boil down to the behavioural change that you need to lay the right conditions for families and communities to actually move. I mean, if we step back on a systems, because policy nerds and everything else, we like looking at systems, perspectives and stuff. I mean, could clean cooking stress the grids even further? You've just explained from the EV front how fragile in some cases that is. Or could it actually help stabilise demand if managed properly, Rebekah? I mean, is there anything in that at all?
Yes. Well, there isn't a lot of research on this because electric cooking is still quite niche. The solutions that are more coming to the floor are biomass alternatives like bioethanol. We see a lot of shift towards LPG solutions. So electric cooking is still quite a unique set of technologies that we tend to see more in higher income households and communities. So the story in terms of grid potential benefits isn't as well studied. But given that, what I will say is at WRI, we're taking a fairly unconventional approach to this issue of clean cooking. And rather than looking at households, we're looking at institutions. If you think about schools, hospitals, vocational centers, there are thousands and thousands of these social service institutions and buildings that are preparing meals at probably the same aggregate rate as what's happening in households. And if you sort of take that entry point instead of the individual household, now the difference is that these social service institutions have budgets that are allocated to them that are secure because they're government backed and they have access to credit from financial providers like banks. And so it may be possible to build a business model that works in this context and at least helps us tackle a part of the clean cooking challenge, if not the whole. And if we are successful in that effort and are able to help shift institutions towards clean cooking technologies, then we're talking about the aggregate levels enough that may contribute to either grid weakening or strengthening. But a lot of research still left to be done there.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Go back to some other points, just demystifying, I suppose, and looking at, in Europe, we often treat electrification as an automatic outcome of a rising wealth within particular countries or blocks, wherever it may be. So I suppose in African countries, and you've touched on this already slightly, just does the biomass-based cooking persist even when GDP, or do you foresee that growing as GDP grows again? And going back to your business case, how do you intertwine that?
Yeah, and yes, so biomass doesn't disappear automatically as income rises in Africa because the transition to clean cooking, as I mentioned, isn't driven by wealth alone. It's a whole ecosystem of conditions that rarely align. And I think this is an important point that you're making, Una, because the more progressive economists, like ecological economists, have held for decades that globally, whether we're talking about high-income countries or low-income countries, GDP as a measure of growth and prosperity is insufficient. And it's really these other factors of accessibility, of affordability, of availability of reliable alternatives and technologies that are true indicators of development. And these often lag behind GDP. And so that principle is at play here in biomass, right? That even as economies are expanding, GDPs are rising, technologies like LPG and electricity are still remaining very unavailable and unaffordable and unreliable. So it's a great point, because if we actually care about a transition to cleaner, sustainable economies that work for people, that work for nature, and that work for climate, perhaps one of the most important transitions to keep our eye on is the clean cooking transition. It's kind of like a litmus test, right?
Yeah.
So that's a really interesting way to think about it.
Absolutely. It's certainly, we're seeing little nuggets like this, very, very differing to North America and Europe and even certain parts of Asia. But like we did cover Latin America actually in our second part too of the leapfrogging. And some of the similarities and points you were saying there was equally coming up in the conversation.
Yeah, and it's. I mean, when I'm at fault here for my own. When I look at decarbonisation, I veer very heavily towards power, and because that's a significant piece, and then transportation, and I do have a lens, and this has been fascinating to actually sort of show that there's other strata on the demand side that doesn't follow some of the same routes in terms of some of the system or some of the system thinking, some of the sequencing, and it does demonstrate how much that people impact a lot of this, and in terms of sort of this, it's the full ecosystem that they're involved with, and what we've discussed so far obviously is very much on the demand side, and on the supply side. So if we move the conversation more to the supply side, we've looked at where Africa might skip some rungs, Rebekah, but for countries and we as a business, when I wear my business, we work in these sort of markets. These countries, the economies are, some of them, tied very much to oil and gas. They're producing countries, and the ladder isn't just a metaphor. It's revenue, it's jobs, it's budgets. So the transition story could look potentially quite different there, and perhaps far more delicate as well. So can I ask a question? How does the transition look different in countries that are oil and gas producers, so the Nigeria, Angola, Ghana, Mozambique, maybe compared to the non-producers with maybe high hydro and our, the power system's already quite decarbonised? I mean, could you take us through that as a starter?
Yes, and it actually ties us very nicely back into the EV transition conversation where we talked about the demand side. So this is now a supply side conversation, and I think it's important to talk about the African oil boom, because the numbers that are out there suggest that Africa as a continent is accounting for more than 35% of all new global oil discoveries. 60% of these finds were in frontier or very immature basins, such as in Namibia and Cote d'Ivoire, and so there is this definite positioning of Africa as a frontier for exploration and production, and that frontier is really, I think, more legitimate than the oil demand frontier. So your question is, in hydrocarbon states, what's the transition going to look like? Are they going to be sort of hindered in a transition to cleaner technologies at home by this dependence on fuels? And I think that we have to look at the export nature of the dependence, the fiscal reliance of these countries on oil revenues, and obviously think about the political economies at stake both at home and internationally, which make diversification obviously a much slower and more cautious exercise. Those non-producers, by contrast, like the Kenyas, the Ethiopias, tend to be more pragmatic, more opportunity driven, very strategic about trying to position renewables at the center of new economic opportunity. So I think the producers, the hydrocarbon producers in this transition really have to think about what do they stand to gain and what do they really stand to lose. And do that math very carefully, because there are risks, major risks of going too quickly down a route of exploration, sort of driven by what the potential opportunities and benefits may be.
Mm-hmm. No, that's really insightful, Rebekah. And I suppose just to bring it to full circle and going back to my earlier point on lessons learned and where the learnings, particularly for Europe, I work in the policy and regulatory side quite a bit, and it frustrates me that we constantly share our learnings externally or overseas and almost impose them certainly on some jurisdictions in emerging markets. But I think things are changing, and I think you've convinced me more than ever. And speaking to some of my colleagues and peers in the likes of Latin America as well, I'm seeing similar. We can take a hell of a lot of learnings from new emerging markets and jurisdictions, which are actually quietly championing some really, really impressive policy shifts, which I don't think they've been heard and raised. Their profile has been raised here certainly in the environment I've been working on. So I suppose across clean cooking and bottom up transport electrification and looking at the realities facing some of the oil producing states, what is Africa doing differently? What is your secret sauce? Where and what should Europe be paying attention to? And in particular, where the UK and the EU genuinely could unlock some barriers that we could impose on our models and take those key learnings, because we certainly could do with some help in a number of areas.
Well, I think that Africa is quietly rewriting the script of what transitions look like. Instead of a top-down sort of car first, gas then electric pathway, as we've talked about, we're seeing bottom-up, service first, informal first transitions, which really upends the classical logic. And I think things to pay attention to here are trends and insights like demand being driven from the bottom up. And thinking about what could that look like in the context of more advanced markets. Likewise, thinking about renewable energy resources, especially those that have the opportunity or present the opportunity to act as base loads like hydropower and geothermal. What does it look like to truly position them as central to an economic development paradigm rather than on the periphery of that paradigm? And not having to replicate sort of a fossil fuel lock-in path, and then obviously thinking about the real constraint being systems constraints rather than the willingness to transition. In my perspective, Africa is probably the continent or one of the continents that needs least convincing about a low carbon economic opportunity on the horizon. Because we have here a situation where it's not about pivoting away from a fossil fuels base, it's about how we would rapidly expand power generation and distribution in ways that are affordable, resilient, and stay the course of climate compatibility. And to your question about sort of what's meaningful there for Europe to take away, I wrote an article recently on recommendations for meaningful Africa-Europe partnership on energy transitions. And to paraphrase that, I think the most useful role that the UK and the EU can play is actually not in exporting policy templates, but because we've just talked about how different the contexts are, but actually unlocking bottlenecks that African countries already know that we have, especially those that are beyond our own ability to control, given the global financial and power architecture. One of those, for instance, is the global architecture of who decides who is credit worthy. We all know ratings agencies like S&P and Finch sit alongside the IMF and the World Bank, and they really shape the cost of capital by assigning these risk scores that oftentimes penalize African countries for structural conditions that we didn't create: commodity dependence, very narrow export bases. Those are not created by our own design, but yet result in the fact that African governments routinely pay 5, 10 plus times more for borrowing the same sums of money as their counterparts in more advanced markets. So that's just one example. Another example is, of course, the challenge of debt and the debt crisis right now. Today, African countries owe over a quarter of their combined GDP in debt to external parties. And we know that Europe can play a really meaningful role in easing debt distress by helping to fix the architecture that keeps systemic biases in risk rating at bay or being what they are. So to me, these are sort of the spaces where, in short, the most transformative thing that Europe could do is not try to design the transition, but reshape the conditions that would make the transition possible. Yes, exactly.
I mean, you actually answered a question that I was about to ask, and I'll ask it just so almost you can sort of rephrase that in a very, is that we have, compared with pre-COVID times or 5 or 6 years ago, I have to say, we assumed as an industry, those of us working in energy, assumed there was kind of quite a consensus about decarbonisation between our parties. So a general election, for instance, didn't come with a major risk of policy. It was, is it that flavour or is it that flavour? Is it slightly slower? Is it, there wasn't a massive pivot sort of risk. What we've seen in the US is a huge pivot. And there is a number of countries in Europe where there is a risk, all of a sudden that kind of political risk in some markets from an energy policy has risen up, which means you're dependent on that. There is all of a sudden there's that risk of a pivot. What I've heard there is that actually that's not the same scale of risk, because it's not a pivot. That's what you mentioned there. I mean, so actually, from election to election or administration to administration, there's a level of consensus of direction and trajectory.
Yes, and I think that the question is, how do we maintain a pathway rather than shift from one pathway to another? What the African context makes clear is that this transition is not necessarily a neat ladder, and I think is sort of the theme of this entire podcast. You can hear us coming back constantly to this theme of the ladder. It's really about necessity and opportunity and people's needs, and being able to be adaptive to those needs at the end of the day. So I think what we're seeing is this idea that households electrify cooking when it makes sense, and mobility providers will transition when it makes sense. And what we have to do is help make that sense reality, right? Help make that sense happen. And that's now taking a more flexible, demand-driven take on transitions than we do, I think, more globally. And really the important place to support is by removing the structural barriers that not just Africa, but a lot of these emerging markets didn't create on debt distress, cost of capital, risk assessment, and really making sure that the enabling conditions present a fair playing field.
Yeah, I love it, Rebekah. I think you hit the nail on the head in 2 points for me, was the practical, where it makes sense. And I think we lose sight of that quite a bit. And it's just so genuine and it's the right thing to do when it makes sense. And then going back to your other point, which struck me at the very start, was, you were talking about Jamaica and Trinidad, and you were talking about energy security. We're here now, and that is one of the biggest topic areas. We're back full circle, and we're talking about energy security now at, particularly here in the UK and Europe. It's all about that with the global geopolitics at the minute. So it's amazing. I suppose to round it out, I am totally going to be picking your paper because this has been fascinating. And I'm going to open it on two fronts, and John is probably going to look at it, prompted by John's phone and his metal love for metal. Have you any last parting comments for our listeners? But I'd also like to know, what music do you listen to? Because I have a feeling you might have some interesting ones.
I parting thoughts for your listeners. I think if your audience space is very much Europe, the US, energy sector sort of technologists or technology enthusiasts, my parting shot would just be that there's so many ways right now, and this is such a great time to engage with counterparts in Africa. There's a lot of opportunity to invest, a lot of opportunity to be part of change, and it doesn't even have to be from a charitable or aid oriented perspective. So I would say, reach out, find ways to connect and get involved. It's a very exciting space, as I said, that sort of changes on a regular basis. And in terms of music, I mean, I am as standard as they come in the Caribbean: dancehall, soca, reggae. That's my heartbeat. Which I don't know if you guys get a lot of that in the Celtic regions, but we're big on the reggae.
We do indeed. There's a lot. Yeah,
oh,
you
do
get quite a
you?
bit here. Well, I'm in a place. I'm in Glasgow in Scotland, and John is just the other side of the coast from us here. But it's a big music city, so you get quite a lot of diversity in music. And I think, John, you mentioned one in particular, which was nice cross pollination, actually, maybe on with the metal side.
Yeah, when we did the intro, I mentioned the band Skindred, so I'll put a link in our show notes for that. That combination of hard rock and reggae as well, from Wales of all places.
Oh,
another Celtic connection, because that's the other thing that we chatted about, was we've all got a very big Celtic connection in this podcast, and yourself, Rebekah, as well.
Yeah, absolutely. For me, in fact, one of the places, it will sound so strange, but one of the places on my bucket list of places to visit is Cork, Ireland. Like, I have to visit Cork specifically.
I give you my podcaster in crime.
Well, I'm going to get my ass kicked at home now, because I was born in Cork, but I'm a true 100% Kerry woman. If anyone ever challenges me, but. Anytime you're looking to come over, Rebekah, I'm more than happy to give you a tour. I lived in Cork for more than 10 years, so I went to university there.
Oh my gosh!
So anytime you want to come,
I love that.
It's one of my favourite cities in Ireland. Is Cork. I have to say. Before I came into renewables, I was doing business in Cork with composting and bio. Sort of taking waste and composting it, and to remove it from a cost, which was a waste, and put it into. So we were working with farmers about taking municipal waste and turning it into compost and things like that. So.
I will 100% take you both up on that offer. This is like so exciting to me.
We're going to do that. We're going to do that. So I mean, for me, this has been fascinating, because it started a journey when I pulled up a couple of articles and then started looking into, decarbonisation on the transportation side and the ladder. I mean, what's been brilliant here is that, yes, we've discussed EVs and electrification of transportation, but also how it's happening and clean cooking pilots. But what I think a massive lesson that I think we should take in Europe and elsewhere is that showing us that energy transitions don't have to follow ladders. There is, it's a responsiveness on the ground of the economics of behaviour of what's installed, the starting point of a community and a country, and there's much more agile ways than our models assume, and that's been fantastic. That's been really fascinating and very positive to hear, because we are seeing some rollbacks from some of our EV policies in Europe, actually, under the weight of both the cost of it, but also from the lobby groups, the motor manufacturers, etc. So it's fantastic to sort of hear that kind of assertiveness on policy, but also the agile way that things are happening. And I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. And thank you again for joining us on this podcast. And as you said, things happen quite one from year to year, things change quite a lot. So I think we need to put a pin into something in 12 months' time and revisit this topic and explore where everything is, and come back and revisit the topic. But thank you again. So on behalf of Una and myself and the ReVolting Podcast and the team behind the cameras and everything, we just want to say thanks, and check out Skindred.
Yeah. I will. The pleasure was mine. Thank you guys for having me, and I love the idea of a check-in in a year's time. I'm sure we'll be in such a different place then. So watch the space.
Maybe even in Cork.
Fantastic. Oh yeah,
we should do it. We should do it live in Cork.
We'll record it in Cork.
Sign me up.
Oh, John, what a conversation. That was absolutely fantastic. And Rebekah was just, I'm still wrapping my head around some of the comments Rebekah had, and just her insight and detail into the market. I mean, John, what were your key takeaways from that discussion?
I really enjoyed that as well, and I learned so much. And the thing is, we could have doubled it and had a two-parter, to be perfectly honest, because the amount of things we didn't talk about. But in terms of the takeaways was just how different to the assumption that there is in terms of that the starting point for these communities and markets is different, and we kind of know that, but how instrumental that is, and also how different it's going to be in terms of the transition from the first thing is from the EVs, from the decarbonisation of the transportation, that it totally reflects actually the realities on the ground, which is affordability, accessibility. And what we didn't talk about was the relationship that China's beginning to have, which is maybe something we can pick up maybe again at a later point if we want. Is because they're bringing in these these low price points, as Rebekah was saying, the price points now, meaning that it's just an economic decision to take this, an electronic two-wheeler or a three-wheeler. So so it's happening very ground up, which was fascinating, but also supported by policy. So the dynamic nature of it and the agile nature of the transition, but also what came across was the assertiveness, or rather the progressiveness of policy as well, in a way that puts us to shame a little bit in Europe.
That was a key one for me. I suppose the strength of the policy, and listening to figures like 15% penetration in the market, that's incredible. We could only just dream of that here, particularly when you're just looking at two-wheelers and electrified scooters in that manner. But I suppose the practicality and pragmatism, I think, struck me the most, and how it was approached. And, leaning back into that, the big conundrum we're here with at the minute in Europe around energy security. Yeah. And I think those lessons learned, we need to start looking out and getting out of our bubble here and looking at shifting how we approach policies, not being, I suppose, step out of our lane and maybe look up and see how we could do things better and be prepared, I think. And again, I think that the point around renewables and looking at I suppose alternative energy sources in particular, it's not a flashpoint across the various political sectors, and again we're seeing that in the global south, so it is quite interesting. I really liked your point on cost of capital and looking at funding.
That could have been a really interesting additional, to really, I think that's an area that could be a really interesting topic. I think that, instead of saying this is the template, this is, this is how you do it, it's actually, what's stopping us? Well, one of them is actually the cost of the cost of capital, the cost of debt, and it's like, that is actually how the West can enable. I mean, the other thing was that for me was the the fact that it's so pragmatic. So, I think we discussed this actually at Scottish Renewables, was that, or maybe not on camera, but was that the decarbonisation industry, renewables, etc. We've been through an evolution of, first it was very much on climate when that was the main driver. Then it was on, when the costs started to come down, it's the low, it's levelized cost of energy, it's the cheap, and energy security. So it's in Africa, I don't see that kind of change. It's like, no, there's an energy security is a major driver. Affordability is a major driver. The economics is just there. So the politics is being taken away a little bit in a way that we're seeing it come in Europe and the West, that there's actually a general consensus that's the trajectory, because actually it makes sense. And what I got was that allows them to say, and it's also the right thing for communities and the planet and the ecosystem. Whilst I do find that that's getting lost a little bit in our discussions in Europe.
I think doing the right thing. Yeah, doing the right thing certainly seems to be at the back of the mind in some cases, and that practicality as well. We need to be pragmatic, making sure that we have the business case, and it's something we can certainly get over the line in particular. Okay, John, great conversation, and well done getting that speaker in. And I suppose to round it out, to our speakers, make sure you get your comments in. We're waiting on a few more. We've had some really good ones, which we're lining up some more speakers and some topic areas orientated around that. And please tune in over the next few months and weeks to further good discussions and leaning into some of those hard topics, and certainly taking the temperature on where we are at the minute, John. I think it's going to be an interesting few months. So, John, in true fashion, I'll hand over to you for our sign off. I'm Una Brosnan,
and I'm John MaCaskill. This is the ReVolting Podcast. So keep the rotors turning and the heads banging. See you at the next episode.
See you then.